Good afternoon, almost, I guess. Welcome to Sean's Thoughts, and my name is Sean with a W. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, and well, today I'm here to talk about reframing. And what reframing is the ability to take something that we have experienced or seen and to understand it in a different way that it helps us relieve any trauma or negative connotations with that experience. And so, what brought me to this topic, I guess you could say, is yesterday I was on YouTube and I had noticed that sometime in January there were headlines regarding the Amazon closing their warehouses in Quebec. And there were 7 of them, and there was a lot of jobs to be lost, and there was a lot of controversy around it. Now, if you guys all remember, Amazon got pretty powerful during 2020, 2021 because of all of the closures that were happening and the inability to go out into the world and exist as we had once done, going into brick and mortar stores. Because what had happened was that many small businesses were put out of business. And this was the result of what had happened during 2020. However, it was also the result of the ongoing pressure that was put on these small businesses to do with prices and such. And so Amazon has been one of the companies who has been responsible for the destruction of the consumer market in Canada. But now, it wasn't just Amazon, in my opinion. It was that Amazon gave us, the people, the ability to buy a larger assortment of goods, sometimes at a lower price. Sometimes it was only a few cents lower, and sometimes it was considerably lower, depending on how rare the item was. But my own experience with Amazon was, as the time went by, more towards the end of 2020, I actually noticed that the prices on some of the things I was looking for was going up considerably. I would even look, like, for instance, when I bought my massage table, the manufacturer of the massage table, who had a website up, had listed their MRSP. And when I went to buy the actual massage table, it was $200 more. Now, I was looking to start up a new business at that time, so I overlooked that cost. However, it was something that held with me, that the prices were going up at that time. And it seemed, and there were reports, that Amazon was actually buying up stock from other vendors and distributors and such, and then putting them on their own website. And they even got to the point of getting people to sell stuff on Amazon. And so, well, Amazon was a very convenient way of getting stuff or buying stuff, because at that time we had started not being able to enter stores as much as we were, because that was, in the sense, the kind of the plan. However, Amazon essentially began to dominate the market. Their little trucks, their little gray prime trucks, driving everywhere, delivering things. They put Amazon in the Shameless TV series. They heavily advertised everywhere. And essentially, Amazon infiltrated the Canadian consumer market and effectively destroyed it. There are very few Canadian-owned businesses that sell a lot of stuff that there once was. The mom and pop stores started to close up and vacated, along with the Walmart. Those two companies, which, by the way, regardless if they say anything to do with Canada, they are American or international. They are not Canadian in any way, and they may provide Canadian jobs at the meager amounts they do, but they aren't Canadian. So anyways, because they do call it Walmart Canada and they call it this Canada, they stick the word Canada in there to imply that there is Canadian content within it, or business within it. But essentially, Amazon got to the point where then they started creating these massive distribution centers, and I've seen two of them in my own area, and they take over a large portion of the industrial area. And well, they maybe have needed for their idea of dominating the market, they have essentially come into Canada quite strongly since the 2020 situation and knocked a lot of other local businesses out. And of course, these being not Canadian companies, regardless of what they say, the money doesn't stay within our borders. The money leaves, in my opinion. Yes, it employs people. And that's where this conversation really comes in. It comes into the point where Amazon has given Canadians jobs. 100% I agree. However, it took away a lot more jobs than that, in my opinion, because the stores which would have, like the local stores which would have had their own merchandise sell, were no longer able to sell it now because a multinational corporation essentially took everything over. And so with and when I saw the Amazon was closing their warehouses, immediately my first thought or feeling was this is a good thing. It is a good thing if non-Canadian companies leave Canada. And although that creates what we'll call it, it creates a transitional period which is uncomfortable to many, including myself. It's helping us move more towards, in my opinion, the direction of more of a self-sustaining country. And like, I moved into a city. When I moved here, there was no Walmart, and there was supposedly a lot of opposition towards Walmart coming in. We had at that time a lot more independent, smaller stores within our city, within our downtown core, and we also at that time had a store called Zellers, and Zellers was owned by the Hudson Bay Company, and they had a decent store in here. When the Bay chose to close Zellers, all of them, Target moved in, and Target was another American company, by the way, and they came in and they essentially made promises that they couldn't keep, and they weren't able to maintain their companies here, which left, and when they left, which left a lot of retail space, and including my own city. So while there was lots of opposition against Walmart coming in here into my city, Walmart eventually got in. Actually, after that, Walmart got into a lot, especially after 2020. There was a lot of expansion, and once again, Walmart and Amazon, the brick and mortar store and the online store, basically set themselves up to dominate. There was another American store, Best Buy, and they essentially came in and bought a Canadian company called Future Shop, and then they closed all the Future Shops. So they originally kept the Future Shops open as a fake competitor to Best Buy, and eventually they just put them all back into Best Buys. Now, back to what I was saying before, when I saw this news, because I hadn't been aware of the news for quite a long time. As I'd mentioned before, I stopped really watching it because I understand the propaganda and the fear porn that the mainstream gives us is. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, well, that's a great sign. That's a great sign that these companies, which I feel are on the decline, are leaving, and they can go back to their own country. And although it may be challenging for the people who have lost their jobs, I feel that I'm very passionate right now. I can feel the energy in me because this is definitely something that I've often talked about. So as I'm trying to deliver a flow of my thoughts, I'm at the same time feeling the different types of energies coming at me. Some are for, some are against what I'm saying. And so I, for one, firstly and foremost, believe that we as a country, we as Canadians, but this can be we as in whatever country you are listening to, need to, ought to, should, could, would benefit from bringing manufacturing and essentially business back to our own countries, our own individual countries based on where we're from. Meaning if you're in India, it would be better if you brought back all the manufacturing to India, and that the stuff that you manufactured in India would be in India. Now, there are different goods around the world that are definitely like unique to the areas they're created, but for most of the stuff that we currently have, such as cars and TVs and DVD players and all these other like smaller goods, cell phones, for example, bringing those manufacturing back to the actual country they're distributed in would not only reduce the amount of oil and gas that's wasted by transporting things all over the place, they would employ the people that lived there. So for instance, if Quebec saying goodbye to Amazon, farewell, and never come back, for their warehouses at least, would then say, okay, well, what can we create here and for our own communities, for our own people, and re-employ those people, basically doing something more constructive than just shipping stuff all over the place. And that's really what the warehouses are. It's so that people could, or corporations could, manufacture things in places where the wages were considerably lower and then transfer them all the way over here so they could sit in warehouses so we could quickly and easily get them. See, this benefit I don't see as being for the people at all. This benefit of having these large warehouses, well, it did employ people. There was even talk of unionization when it came to these warehouses, and perhaps that was a big part of the reason why they left, because there's been so much news that I did see prior to signing out of mainstream news where the working conditions in these warehouses were horrific. And well, I can't say that's true or not because I don't really know. Funny enough, a prime Amazon truck's driving by right now. Regardless, that I do see as being possible. The abuse of workers by corporations all over the world has consistently been in the headlines, and you can't really dispute that. When corporations large enough that they care more about the shareholder than any sort of like entity itself. I don't really know how to explain what I'm meaning by that, but where money becomes the motivator, well then trying to cut costs and corners is usually self-evident, or tends to happen. So back to what I was saying before is, with the Amazon warehouse closures in Quebec, which apparently did happen, and then they got into the courts in sometime in the summer months, and I read a few headlines and articles from that. However, well, this is an example of the struggle that we are going through in the economic downturn and decline, permanent decline, in my opinion. It is a good sign, because where we lose those American corporations, and I'll name a lot of them. Many people don't know that a lot of the companies in Canada are not owned by Canadians or Canadian companies, even if they have the maple leaf on them. So let's name a couple of them, or lots of them actually. So as I said, Best Buy Canada is not Canadian owned. Like I said, I don't really care whether you add the word Canadian and you get a Canadian GST number or a business registration and try to pawn yourself off as a Canadian company, because you're not. Walmart Canada is not Canadian. Staples is not Canadian. And I'm not going to say where these places are from. You can go look at it yourself if you are so inclined. Other stores like, Amazon obviously is not Canadian. We have other large corporations in Canada, but we also have some, or Starbucks is another example. We all know that that's not Canadian. It's a Seattle-based conglomerate company who's all over the world now. There's other companies who once were Canadian. So for instance, Tim Hortons is no longer Canadian. The Toronto Dominion Bank is no longer Canadian. They're owned by an American banking system. I forgot which one, but they're somehow connected with First something or other. And Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that we take for granted as being Canadian because they use the maple leaf or they call them the real Canadian superstore, we automatically jump to because that word's in there that it's Canadian, not knowing that Loblaws is another company which is more than just the real Canadian superstore. They also own several other stores. There's a lot of companies out there that they try to focus on being Canadian or made in Canada, or they use different techniques in order to subliminally, in my opinion, convince us that they are so. None more so that once, I guess around the summertime, there was a big, I don't know what the word, but a big dissatisfaction with America, in which a lot of Canadian, for very good reasons, that a lot of Canadians started to boycott American-made items, and yet we still continued to buy them. So, for instance, more companies that aren't Canadian. Shell is not Canadian. I don't believe Esso is Canadian. Like, we're literally every day giving our money away to American corporations and American whatever, and not even just American, we're giving them away to, like I said, multinational corporations. And we could probably go and say that most logoed or most companies that we recognize their logo as quality, that they aren't Canadian. And that money, other than the investment that they're putting in with labor, for instance, the amount of money that they're paying for labor, and then of course through paying for labor, then most of that money is going into income taxes that go directly to the government. So there are people that are benefiting it. However, the majority of people aren't benefiting it, and we're definitely seeing that now. So winding all the way back to that article that I had saw, and what I wanted to talk about reframing is reframing, as I said, is to be able to look at a situation, and although we or others view it in a certain way, that we can then look at it in a different way. And when I started to see it, as I said, and I continue to feel this, that it is a positive thing because, and well, those corporations which did take away from Canadian owned and operated and everything else businesses, a lot of mom and pops, as I mentioned before, Future Shop, Tim Hortons is gone. They're not Canadian. They really should remove that maple leaf. To me, the maple leaf or any sort of trying to claim they're Canadian, it really takes away from honesty within and transparency within our communities. But so many different franchises, in a world that we live in where, things are changing so fast, and things can change quite fast before we even know it. One of the examples was, I would probably feel confident enough to say that the average Canadian doesn't realize that the TD Bank is no longer a Canadian bank. And what I mean by that is, who owns the bank? And actually, in our world right now, not very many people own anything. It's a minority, a very, very select minority that controls a lot of the other businesses below them. So when we experience something, or even if we have already experienced in the past, sometimes sitting back and looking for the silver lining and then expanding on it and then seeing where that thread goes. And well, I see the thread going towards more sovereign, locally owned businesses. I've often talked about, as I said before, bringing manufacturing back, but it's not just bringing manufacturing back, it's bringing it's maintaining the money or the energy that's used within the local community itself. So why not have locally owned stores selling to locally people, rather than having these businesses that have the same name selling the same product spread throughout the entire country. Last year when I went across the country, one of the businesses that I had noticed that was beginning to spring up in all of these smaller communities along the south of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and such was a store called Shoppers Drug Mart. See, in the past, a lot of these towns, from my understanding or my communication with people, they didn't necessarily want these corporate businesses in there. They didn't want these big businesses in there. Well, a few years ago, Loblaws bought Shoppers Drug Mart, and they essentially turned it into a smaller version of the Great Canadian Superstore, except for they were more focused on pharmacy. I actually got into a little controversy before I left Facebook in which I commented about this because when Loblaws took over Shoppers Drug Mart, they did exactly what the Superstore did. And I don't know if you noticed this, and perhaps you may or may not, but they put chocolate and all the candies and all the garbage junk food that has high fructose corn syrup in it. They put it all up in the front to get people or encourage people to make those impulse buying decisions that harmed their health while they were waiting in line for their food. See, things like that aren't just a accident. They're specifically targeted. But what was interesting about the situation with Shoppers Drug Mart is right behind it in the Shoppers that we have here in my city, they talk about protecting their customers' health. And yet they bought bonbons and chocolate and all these brands that, a lot of that stuff does harm, especially the high fructose corn syrup. It becomes a lot more addictive than your normal sugar. But on Facebook, I decided to point this out, and immediately I got so much backlash. See, at that time, I never realized how much AI does have the ability, and I thought these were probably all people, but I can easily see how that may have been one or two people, but then an automated defense system in the social media market of bots trying to basically push me away from commenting it anymore. However, I've recently, as I said, I really don't care anymore. I want to share with everyone all the well, getting people, especially if they're in a store because they want better health, getting them to buy more chocolate and candies and garbage that they don't need, well, that's, in my opinion, a crime. So we'll see what happens with that after now that I've been speaking about it. However, I don't know where I was going with all that, and every time I say those words, I tend to fall off track. So that was my little story of when Shoppers, oh yeah, that's where I was going, with Shoppers Drug Mart. So when I was traveling across Canada last year on my road trip, I stopped in many of these communities, and lo and behold, many of them had newly being built Shoppers Drug Marts. See, they couldn't get into these communities for whatever reasons, and so they got in through building new shop drug marts at so many different plazas. Like that was probably the number one business. And so they're essentially bringing in products that would be sold. Like TNT was also bought by Loblaws, and TNT is a Chinese supermarket here in my province. And yeah, so with all that in mind, the more that I see of all these big consumer or these big corporate box stores closing, the more I celebrate. Because to me, that's a sign of that we're moving in the direction of becoming self-sustaining again. See, at one point in time, we had a car company in Canada and its name was Saturn. Well, it was closed. We had airlines perhaps that were more Canadian than they are now. Well, those days are ended. In a world where everything is put on the stock market and kind of like the shareholders are the ones who they're answerable to, which means, they're really more answerable to money. We get into a place where, there's a lot more deception and corruption and a lot more lawsuits and stuff like that. Loblaws was in the news, I guess, last year for overpricing bread, and then there was a big class action lawsuit on that. And so when I see all of that, I'd like to reframe it in that we're not losing jobs. We're not necessarily losing. In the moment of now, it appears that we are losing. However, in the overall scheme of things, we're gaining because we are having these businesses that came into our country. They monopolized businesses. Government organizations allowed it to happen. They prevented unions from being created. And when they were about to create it, perhaps just like what happened in, perhaps it's like maybe what happened, and I'm keeping myself open to the full details of it. But, anyways, they limit our choices in a sense by, for instance, if I wanted to buy a computer a long time ago, I would have had many stores to go buy that computer. Now, if I want to buy a computer, I really only think Best Buy or Staples. Or if you want, you can buy it from the actual vendors online, but there isn't as much choice anymore. And even my own experience in the retail industry, these companies were actually pushing to even cancel the salesperson. I worked for a business called The Brick, and actually The Brick was once Canadian owned as well, no longer. Yes, it may be here and may run under Canada, but well, I was working it anyways. It was sold into the stock market and stuff like that, and I'm not sure what's happened with it recently, but I know Leon's is bought it or something like that. And once again, I don't see Leon's as being Canadian, but I'm not really sure about that exactly. So, back with being positive. The more and more of these companies that leave us, the better we are doing. Some of the beautiful things that I've seen in my own communities is I've seen Freshies close and then an independent store pop up. I've seen A&W's close and an independent store pop up. I've seen a lot of different stores that are international franchises close, and then an independent pops up and goes into there. And that's honestly one of the cognitions or insights or whatever we want to call it, downloads, that as we get an more towards where we're going, there's going to be a lot of businesses. I've seen gas stations close that were like big names, and then smaller stores move into them. And this allows for more Canadians or more local people being more in charge of their own lives and not being required to work for these no name, well, not no name, but these corporate entities that, they might sell things cheaper. They might have things a little more standardized, stuck in routine. They might have the ideas and the of how to present their products a lot better because they've done the research and the development on how to merchandise and such. However, at the core of it, they are taking more than they're giving. Driving down the cost of items, for examples, means the little competitor down the street, he can't afford to meet that price. Often I've heard stories about Walmart walking in and demanding something to be sold at a certain price or walking away. And often, people will accept that. But driving down the price and paying less means that the people working there are earning less. And, we've moved into a state now where we're all earning less. We're all being asked, or not asked, but forced to accept whatever these corporations do. And when we say, for instance, come together and want to create a union to increase the quality or the safety of our work, well, those companies are just pulling out. And, as I said before, I'm happy to see every single non-Canadian company take a hike. And that's one thing I'm very passionate about because I see the degradation and the destruction, and I've witnessed it firsthand. I've been a very observant person, and I've taken notes in my head where it mattered. And yeah, so when I began this conversation, I was very passionate because I would like to see, whether you're an immigrant or a permanent resident or Canadian, like you're a local, I would rather see all of us benefiting from our efforts all day long, and not a stock market or a stock or some imaginary board or whatever, or anyone really, to earn money off the backs of people. I feel one of the things that we're going to be moving into, or that we are already shifting into, is that no one earns money off the backs of another. And that includes landlords who buy 3 or 4 or 5 apartments and try to sell them or try to rent them off for the price of their mortgage plus all the other fees. I was actually watching a video made by a man who's in British Columbia, and he was talking about the news that there are more than 2,500 condos in Vancouver that are newly finished or finished, period, and that they're vacant. Means they're or not vacant, that they're unpurchased. It means the developers have developed and built so many condos in Vancouver that they can't even sell them because of the excessively ludicrous prices that are put on them. But that's not just in Vancouver, that's across everywhere. I see them in Surrey, I see them in my own city. When I drove across the country, I saw them when I was in Toronto, Toronto I saw them. Like all across the country, there are thousands upon thousands of condos that sit empty. And this particular person was talking about developer-owned condos, means condos that hadn't been sold. But I've walked around and I've seen condos that have been sold, like ones that are no longer for sale. There's no for sale sign around the building, but yet there's numerous empty townhouses, empty condos. And, well, it's really interesting in a time that is a housing crisis, in the meaning that I feel that there are the most homeless people that I've ever seen before now. I don't want to even go into that part because that wasn't necessarily what this is about. However, these corporations also are some of these developers too. And so that's another example of, if the developers are going under, I'm saying bye-bye and farewell and never come back. And, sometimes when I say or feel these things, I get like this little shiver in my tummy, like I shouldn't be saying it because I'm wishing someone else negativity. However, I've seen the suffering. I've heard the people crying in the streets. I've seen so many men and women with suitcases rolling down the street, like walking down the street, meaning that they're recently homeless and they're literally have everything in a suitcase. And so it's joyful for me to see these corporations leave. And I think that they're leaving because, as the GIA report said, the world wasn't the way we thought it was. And, you can also perhaps reframe it as those workers in Quebec. I understand that the challenges and the situations that we were in. We've all been driven to buy a lot of crap we don't need. The banks lowered the interest rates like super, super low, just so that we would start borrowing more money and buying more things because their corporations weren't making as much anymore. Well, I understand that we all have a lot of bills. We all have a lot of obligations that we're needing to look at. However, the more and more that these businesses, these corporate logos leave our country, leave our cities and our provinces, the better off we're doing. And those people who experience this transition earlier will be in a better position when it happens at a higher rate. I don't know if anyone understands what exponential means. Well, I no, I'll take that back. I'm not sure if we all understand what the word exponential means. However, I see or foresee a exponential depart from our market coming in the future sometime. And like I said, for those of us who are experiencing it now, we're perhaps more able to, go with the flow, with the transition, that there may be an opportunity, and to trust, most importantly, to trust that God is on our side and there is a plan, not a religious plan, not a plan from any politician or such, but that there is a plan, a tapestry of how everything fits together. And that even that things that feel like they're against us or opposing us, or like, why is this happening? That there is a possible reason, whether it's for a lesson that we are to learn or a lesson that someone else is to learn and we're simply signed up to help them, that there is a reason. And so when these events do continue to unfold, because they will, we are seeing it happen. And even my exposing, for instance, TD Bank and Tim Hortons, perhaps one person sometime will feel and leave those businesses, stop buying from Tim Hortons because, well, the quality is definitely went down, in my opinion. But the TD Bank, maybe more customers will leave the TD Bank knowing that they are no longer Canadian. And so with all these little ripples, we will witness a splash. And that splash will only make us stronger, more independent, more sovereign. And for a lot of people out there, sovereignty is what they are searching for. Independence is what they are searching for. And all of these corporations, they don't provide independence. They provide an easy way for, if you don't toe the line, they'll just find the next person to fill the same boots. And believe you me, my own experience being a salesperson, being a top end salesperson for the Brick, I watched the falling of Best Buy salespeople, for example. I watched the amount of product knowledge and the amount of information in their salespeople die off. And even when I go to look for something now, I often know a lot more than what my salesperson's telling me, because salespersons, or even another way, they used to earn a lot more money. Well, when these big corporations came in, they turned them into order takers. They realized if they put the information on the web, for example, and made these little flashy videos, that people would come in and buy things. Well, they do. They come in and they buy and they look for a salesperson. There's generally no salesperson to be found, although there are salespeople. And they're not necessarily salespeople. They take you to the website and they show you from the website the differences. And then they got a whole bunch of little compare models and such. So even some of the techniques they brought into our country and said, well, we're going to be hiring people, they didn't necessarily educate them with the level of salesmanship that was once sought after in, well, Canadian companies. So I hope this isn't too much of a rant. I hope there's some sort of benefit here to you reading it or listening to it. I mean, I understand that this is going to possibly, it's not going to help my channel grow, meaning that I get the idea that a lot of these companies that I just threw under the bus and then in front of it and then rolled back up over it and then threw gasoline on them and, walked away. I didn't even bother lighting anything because, I just wanted them to smell like gas. Anyways, I realized a lot of what I just said, these big corporations aren't going to necessarily be in line because, they got their AI defense that is trying to create bots and stuff like that. And they definitely, this isn't good for their PR. However, regardless, I'm happy. So sayonara, Amazon. I apologize to all the people that have lost jobs, but I would rather see Canadians creating Canadian products to sell to Canadian customers. And this is not trying to be it's not trying to be in a negative way. I would rather see, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the report, this message also goes for people in India or people in Afghanistan or people in United States, like even in United States, buy from United States products and United States companies. Like, it doesn't mean that we can't buy the odd or like, say, for instance, if there's a car in Japan and someone wants to have it here, well, let's build those cars in the province that they're being sold in. Once again, same thing. Why manufacture things on one side of the world just to transport them, spend the fuel, the gas, the logistics, the making the boats, the crates, dropping crates in the water, the trains, the harbors, the ports? Like, there's just so much created infrastructure in order to move stuff around, when honestly, we could just all bring it back and spend a lot less time working, a lot less time striving, and it would bring down the cost of goods. If the goods were sold, for instance, if you were to sell cars that were made in your province, the cost of that car would be less. Period. Even if you sent the schematic or the design to the different warehouses and then the different, or not warehouses, factories, and then those different factories were to create it. Now, people will say, oh, well, you'd have to build multiple factories. Okay, that's great. That's awesome. So employ local people to build those factories. Once again, giving local employment. And perhaps we don't need, what, 20, 30, 40 different car manufacturers making all of the same, 10, 12 models. Perhaps we can get away with having a lot less. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people don't have choice. There's a lot of other things. Perhaps if we were to do that, we could allow for the painting of cars, for example. So we could get the customization done by the colors we choose rather than having the colors that the dealership gives us or limits us to. So anyways, lots of things for thought. I hope you have a wonderful day. It sees the sun is shining today, so I don't have as much rain, but as always, I'll enjoy rain when it comes. So I love you. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking to you about whatever it is else that I want to talk about later. And if you have any things that you want to talk about, or not that you want to talk about, if there's any things that any thoughts of things that you have that you would like to hear about, perhaps, if I can, I'll definitely oblige. Leave them in the comments, and of course, definitely help me by subscribing and becoming one of my real subscribers, as opposed to the thousands that appear to be bots. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.